Pulpfest our first, followed by Bill Nolan. Last year we had Ken Allard, but he didn't show up. Tonight we have Mike Resnick. Mike is an award-winning science fiction writer, but he got his start many years ago writing Burroughs pastiches, including The Forgotten Sea of Mars and a couple of Ganymede books that he doesn't like to see these days. But that's how he got his start. After turning in a fourth novel, inspired by Conan in the Lancer paperbacks, Mike moved away from writing pastiches about Burroughs and tried to develop his own style. And as he just told me, he did this by writing dirty books. He turned in pseudonymous adult fiction and gothic romances. He sold hundreds of novels and short stories and several thousand articles. Edited tabloid newspapers and men's magazines, but he continued to want to be a science fiction professional. In the early 80s, he returned to science fiction with The Soul Eater, a reworking of Melville's Moby Dick. His breakthrough novel was the international bestseller Santiago, published in 1986. And he has since won 5 Hugo Awards, a Nebula Award, and received a Lifetime Achievement Award in science fiction. And he has the record for, Hugo nominations, or Hugo nominations? So without further ado, Mike Resnick.
Can everybody hear me, or do I need to put this in closer? All right, these are just some dates I need to refer to in my dotage. Like most of you, I guess, I grew up reading Edgar Rice Burroughs and all but worshiping him. And I remember, when I was about 12 years old, there was a magazine called Other Worlds. And they tried to get the readers all to write in to Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated and urge them to publish a book called Tarzan on Mars by John Bloodstone, which was a pseudonym of a guy called Stu Byrne. I've since read the book. It's pretty awful. Burroughs must have thought so too, because they didn't do anything about it. And when I was 13, I thought, aha, that opens the door for me. So I sat down and wrote Tarzan on Mars, my version. And I had to justify Tarzan getting there. Or why would John Carter need him? He's got 8 million men at his disposal. Well, nobody on Mars could swim because they'd never seen any water. So what if there was a hidden lake or ocean somewhere? John Carter would need help from somebody who knew how to swim. And a silly plot, but I was 13. And I probably wrote, 15, 20,000 words or so, and probably forgot about it. And I'll come back to it in a moment. But I got married, and I sold a number of short stories while I was in college. I wrote my way through. And I remember in 1962, Ace started, we don't like the word pirating, they started buccaneering all the Edgar Rice Burroughs books. And it was quite a revelation, because prior to that, when I was growing up, about the only Burroughs books that were new, that were available in the stands, were 8 Tarzans that Grosset and Dunlap was issuing and marketing for kids. And if you knew exactly where to look, and I grew up in Chicago, and in the whole of Chicago there were only 2 bookstores that carried some of the Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated reprints, and they were hard to find. But suddenly, Ace is flooding the market with these things to people who haven't seen them in years and years, and they were just shooting up to the top of the paperback bestseller lists. And, of course, Ace wasn't paying a penny to anybody like Burroughs Incorporated for these. And the justification for this, and it's going to sound a little strange to you, but held up in court, is that Burroughs was such a clumsy writer, we're not allowed to say that in PulpCon, but he was, that almost everything he wrote for the magazines was rewritten. And what happened was not that the Burroughs copyrights on the books ran out, but that the magazine copyright on the magazine versions were never renewed because all these magazines were defunct for years. And Ace was reprinting the magazine versions. And Burroughs went to court and said, oh, come on, the Moon Maid is the Moon Maid. And they said, no, here's the differences. And the court agreed. And Ace got away with 18 books without having to pay a penny's royalties. They also, at that point, brought to the attention of the public, and this was a good thing, the artwork of Frank Frazetta and Roy G. Krinkle, probably the two best Burroughs artists of the last 50 years. Then Ace made a mistake. They published the Tarzan book. Tarzan wasn't any more copyrighted than the others based on the law, but Tarzan was trademarked, and trademarks are eternal. And what happened was Burroughs got him for back royalties on all 19 books, immediately sold the rights to Tarzan and Mars to Ballantine, and left all the non-really good earners with Ace, in case you ever wondered how they split them up that way. Anyway, one of the Burroughs books that came out, one of the very first ones, had a blurb by a guy called Camille Casdessu, and it said that he was the editor of Herbdom. And then, have to be a genius, figure out ERB stood for Edgar Rice Burroughs in the middle of a Burroughs book. And I went to the biggest magazine store in Chicago, the Post Office News, and I haunted it for a week trying to find it. And it wasn't there. Not next to Asimov's, they didn't have Asimov's back then, Astounding or FNSF or anything. I even looked for it among Playboy and Rogue, which was a lot more fun, but I couldn't find it there either. And finally, I asked the owner of the business, how come you won't stock this magazine? And he looks in his files. He said, well, it doesn't exist. So I showed him the book with the quote and smote him with a mighty aha. And he said, I don't care about that. We can't order it. So I finally got tired of looking after 4 months, and I wrote a letter to the editor of Herbdom and sent it through Ace Books. And about 2 weeks later, I saw my first fanzines ever. The guy sent them to me. And within 2-3 weeks, I had written 3 or 4 articles for him, and I had become his assistant editor. And he mentioned an arcane term called WorldCon, which I'd never heard before. I knew they gave out Hugos because I could see that on books' covers, but I didn't know how or where. And it happened that it was in Chicago that year, and I was in Chicago. And my wife kind of cheated all on her own. She had my daughter a week before the WorldCon, so we couldn't go. And I asked her why the hell she didn't hold off till December or something. She gave me a biology text. If you've read my science fiction, you know there's not a lot of science in it. To this day, I don't understand why she didn't have it in February. But she didn't. And we had to go all the way to Washington, D.C. the next year to go to our first science fiction convention. And the train let us off in the basement of the hotel, which was very thoughtful of them. We registered, and a kindly old guy in a white suit, looked kind of like the Good Humor Man, with white hair. He saw that we didn't know our way around, so he took us by the arms and showed us the dealer's room and the art show, sat us down, bought us coffee. I was 21, my child bride was 20. She's still around. Lets me hang around after 50 years. Anyway, at one point, after a couple of hours, he looks at his watch and says, oh, gee, I got some ceremony I have to go to. You want to come along? And we said, sure. And he gets up on stage, and they give him the first ever First Fandom Hall of Fame award, and we still didn't know who it was because he wasn't wearing a badge. And then somebody in the audience yells out, are you ever going to write again? And he says, yeah, I just handed in Skylark Duquesne. And then we realized we'd spent our first 3 hours at our first convention with Doc Smith. Anyway, I met Kaz at that convention, and we also met all the other Burroughs people. The Burroughs Bibliophiles, I should say, had been formed a year or two earlier. They're still around. And the editor and driving force behind it was a guy called Vern Coriel. Vern was a former circus acrobat His specialty, we are told, was walking down a flight of stairs on his head. There are those of us who thought he may have done it once too often. But anyway, he put out the Burroughs Bulletin, and Kaz put out Herbdom, and they were in total opposition to each other. They didn't like each other, and they were competing for readers and all. And somehow or other, Kaz got Edgar Rice Burroughs' permission to let me write a sequel to Lana of Gathel. And I looked through my old stuff, and I found The Forgotten Sea of Mars, or the Tarzan on Mars. I put Tarzan back in the jungle where he belonged, and wrote a 28,000-worder called The Forgotten Sea of Mars. It came out and was given away free in 1965, and that probably helped Herbdom win the 1966 Hugo for Best Fanzine. It was the only Burroughs fanzine that ever won one. And I've since seen that thing going for $150, $200 in dealers' rooms. Let me tell you right now, it's not worth it. Anyway, the next thing I did was even take John Carter out of the story, put it on Ganymede, expanded it, wrote a book called The Goddess of Ganymede. I sold it in hardcover to Don Grant and in paperback. The next year I sold another paperback, a sequel called Pursuit on Ganymede. And the year after that, I got a call from one of the guys I had been freelancing some Gothic romances to, a guy called Walter Zacharias. He owned Lancer. And he said, he's got some kind of book here that, nobody wanted. So he picked up this series of 4 or 5 books. And he didn't like them very much. They don't make much sense to him, but they've sold about 500,000 copies in their first month. Something called Conan. And could I write him a barbarian hero? And I said, sure. So I sat down, I wrote a barbarian hero who didn't fare very well against intelligent people, and called it Redbeard. And at that point, I decided that, it was fun to read that stuff, but that wasn't really what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to write my own stories. So I stopped writing science fiction for 12 years and wrote other stuff, and give people a chance to forget. They didn't. Those goddamn books come back to haunt me at every autograph session. Anyway, I looked around Chicago, and the only job extant at that time in publishing was editing some tabloids and men's magazines. So in my mid-20s, I became the editor of something called the National Insider and another one called the National Tattler. They're just like the National Enquirer, only worse. I think our best-selling issue, and it sold about 400,000 copies, had a headline, Raped by 7 Dwarfs. I don't think I will swear in a Bible that the story was necessarily true. Anyway, anybody see any yellow hair on my head? Because one of the things I did when I was editing those tabloids was I was Jane Mansfield, and I was Mamie Van Doren. I ghosted a weekly column for each of them. I also am not wearing the robe of the Zodiac, but another guy I ghosted for was an astrologer called Sidney Omar, who might still be around for all I know. And I made Sidney famous because in 1968, under his name, I predicted that the Republican nominee would have an initial R. And sure enough, it was Richard Nixon. Everybody forgot that he was running against Romney, Rockefeller, and Reagan. So, what can I tell you about my days in the tabloids? I'll tell you my favorite headline. You're all adults. Once a month, I would take my camera and I would go down to the 2 strip joints in Chicago on South State Street. I think they were called the Follies and the Rialto, or something very like that. I'd take some photos, interview the girls, and it'd be a nice free article for us we didn't have to buy. And one day I was interviewing a girl called Choo Choo Collins, a stripper. And I took her photos, and she said, I want to be on the front page. I said, well, Choo Choo, you got to say something really outrageous to make page 1. I mean, you can't just talk about how you like stripping or something. So she said she would. And this is a girl who was about a 44D back before Silicon. And the headline which I'm not that proud of, said, "I'd rather be flat-chested." The subhead, which I love, is, "You may think she's crazy, but we know Choo-Choo's locomotive." Got to do stuff like that with the tabloids. Anyway, we didn't publish any adult novels. So it wasn't a conflict of interest for me to write them for guys I was buying from, men's magazine editors or whatever, who were selling to me. And over the course of the next 10 years, so help me God, I wrote 226 of them. I never took more than 4 days to write one. I figured if I took a fifth day, my brain would run right out my ears, and that'd be the end of it. But I wasn't alone. There was a guy called Earl Kemp. Anybody know the name? Well, a couple of you do. He won a Hugo for Best Fanzine in 1961, and he chaired the 1962 Worldcon in Chicago. But by the mid-'60s, he was out in California editing Greenleaf Classics, which was the largest of the adult book publishers. And I was talking to him a few weeks ago. He's still around, and he's going to be at ChiCon in a couple of weeks. And he was saying that one of the interesting things was the talent there was there. That in April of 1967, he bought books, all published anonymously, by me, and I'm a Worldcon Guest of Honor this year, and I have 5 Hugos, by Bob Silverberg, a former Worldcon Guest of Honor with 4 Hugos, by Lawrence Block, a mystery grandmaster with 4 Edgars, and by Donald E. Westlake, screenwriter, 3 Edgars, mystery grandmaster, all in a month's time. There were a lot of us writing this stuff, learning, you can make a lot of good money while you were learning how to write. Marion Zimmer Bradley did it. It wasn't limited to my gender. Barry Malzberg, Andy Offutt, a bunch of us. And one day I turned to my wife and said, if I write one more 4-day book or one more 6-hour screenplay. Oh, I also wrote screenplays for Herschel Gordon Lewis, who was voted in the Golden Turkey Awards the second worst director of all time. I like to think my screenplays had something to do with that. 2000 Maniacs, Blood Feast, all those things. Anyway, I thought I'd go nuts if I had to do another. What else can we do to make money? And because I'd like to write science fiction. I think I'm good enough now with 200 books behind me. But beginning science fiction writers don't make very much money. And I've since found out over the years, talking to all the others, that a lot of science fiction writers don't make very much money, including journeymen. Anyway, we were breeding and raising collies. And we had named most of them after science fiction stories. We had 23 champions. Some of them were Champion Gully Foyle, Champion the Gray Lensman, Champion Stormbringer. Anyway, we thought, well, if we can care for 15 or 20 collies and I have time left over to write all this junk, what could a staff of 20 do? So we looked around the country for almost a year, and we bought the second largest luxury boarding and grooming kennel in the country, which was in Cincinnati. And in about 3 or 4 years, it was running very smoothly. We had a staff of 20. And then I was finally able to sit down and write the kind of science fiction I always wanted to write. And it got very, very nice reviews. Within a couple of years, I had a couple of international bestsellers. I'd won some Hugos. I have a book called Kiranyaga, which is the most awarded book in the history of science fiction. It has 67 awards and nominations, including a couple of Hugos, which is something I never thought I was going to do back when I was writing Edgar Rice Burroughs type stuff. And finally, we sold the kennel because 5 years in a row my writing out earned it, which I never thought I would do. Let me check a couple of these dates here if I can. Oh yeah, I was sorry about this. Aha. Yeah, I'll tell you a story about Forrest J. Ackerman. Back in 1967, when I sold my first Academy book, he contacted me and asked to be my agent. I said, sure. I didn't know any better, and I didn't have an agent. So he sold the second one for peanuts, but at least he sold it. And then I gave him, I had written this novel, Redbeard, the Conan thing for Lancer. And it sat on the desk there for a year and a half. The editor was a guy called Larry Shaw, who finally got fired because he hadn't opened the manuscript in 2 years. So it's sitting there, and after a year I get tired of this, and I say, okay, Forey, here's a copy of it, sell it. And 6 months later he returns it to me and says, no, nobody wants it, sorry. And I guess I don't want to represent you after all. I said, oh, fine. And about 2 months after that, they fire this guy, Larry Shaw, and the new editor turns the pile upside down, and mine was on the bottom of it, so now it's on the top, and he bought it. And the next Monday, I get a bill for 10% from Forrest J. Ackerman. And I wrote him, I said, you go to hell. And I got a bill every Monday for a year and a half. The only reason it stopped was because Forey decided he wanted to sell a book called Brave Nude Worlds. And it happened to be to a company where I had a little clout because I had sold him a bunch of books. And I said, don't you guys buy from Forey until I say it's okay. And I called Forey and I said, Forey, if you ever bill me again, we're going to cancel this book and we're going to sue you. Or now we, the company is. And I never got another bill from Forey, and he never asked to be my agent again. And finally, Brave Nude Worlds came out from somebody or other. So, in fact, we were really sorry to see Forey go. At first, he was a wonderful, wonderful adjunct to fandom. But I'm not only a writer, I'm an anthology editor. I've edited some 40 anthologies. And whenever you can't find an author, some guy who's been dead, 27 years, you can't find his estate, you could always go to Forey, who would say, I represent him, give me $10. And, at that point, if the family steps forward and say, hey, well, there's a guy from, he's an accredited agent, go sue him. And when Forey died, that ended, because nobody else is willing to do that. So an awful lot of forgotten authors are going to stay forgotten because of that. Okay, where next? Oh, I should tell you about a collector I knew who, I don't think he's alive anymore, in Chicago. A fellow called Art Dobin. Name mean anything to anybody? He was a white fellow who was, I think, the only white guy in a black neighborhood. His family had been there forever, and the neighborhood had changed, but he hadn't moved. And he collected. He would put together a run of something every year. This year he will put together a run of Weird Tales. Next year, Astounding, whatever. He never read them. The thrill was putting them together, and at the end of the year, after he had done it, he just got rid of me. Well, come by for $50 a piece, get them out of my house. So that's how I got my complete collection of Astounding, and that's how I got my complete collection of Unknown for $50 a piece. I really miss that guy. I did have one other interesting collecting experience. My daughter had a horse when we lived in Libertyville, Illinois, and it had an eastern saddle, and she wanted the western saddle, or the other way around, I can't even remember. And there was a farm community about 15 miles north of us, so I thought I would pick up one of the local newspapers from there and see if any farmer was selling a saddle. And it seems that some couple had just bought a house, an old farmhouse, and there were tons of books in the attic, and they wanted them out of there, and they were paying anybody who would take them away 25 cents a book. And I went there, and I found 3 boxes of near mint in dust jacket first editions of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And in the spirit of generosity, I told them I'd be happy to take them away. They didn't have to pay me. But everybody has a collecting experience. That was mine. Anyway, I should tell you, because there was a Lucifer Jones story in the program book about Lucifer. One day, I guess it's in the mid-'80s, I'm trading tapes, with videotapes with a bunch of guys. And we still had a beta recorder. Everybody knew they were the best. And the problem was they only went 2 hours back then, the tapes. And the guy I was trading with wanted a copy of She, which was going to be on local television. I look at my Malton Sky. She is 117 minutes. Now, there's going to be more than 3 minutes of commercials. So I figure I better sit down there with my remote and just cut out the commercials as I'm recording. And my wife comes down about 20 minutes later, sure that there's a Marx Brothers festival I didn't tell her anything about because I'm laughing so hard. And I was saying, if they could be that funny by accident, Ursula Le Guin and Ursula Andress and the crew, what could somebody do being that funny on purpose? So that night, I outlined a book called Adventures, which took the 12 tritest, most overdone plots from B-movies and pulps ever set in Africa. Slave trading, elephants, graveyards, whatever. And I needed one character to go from country to country. Who's likely to do it? Most likely a minister or preacher. What's funny about that? Nothing. So he became a con man who pretended he was a preacher. And the book was a hit, and I've since, and at the end of the book, he got kicked off the continent he was on. 14 governments got together and said, don't ever come back. And at the end of each Lucifer Jones book, he's thrown off another continent. He's only got one continent left, and then the series is over. But to give you an idea of the kind of stories I did, some of the titles, The Insidious Oriental Dentist, The Clubfoot of Notre Dame, King and Mrs. Kong, that came out about 3 months ago, The Island of Annoyed Souls, and I just love doing these things. And it's also a way to keep my hand in and forces me to keep reading old pulps and watching great old B-movies so I know what I'm making fun of. And along the way, I as much as I've tried to totally disattach myself from my pulpish beginnings, it never quite happens. I've written an introduction to Phil Farmer's Tarzan Alive, and as I was telling somebody here, I totally shocked the University of Nebraska, which published it, by pointing out that it was a spin-off from a dirty book. And in fact, that was a dirty book that had 4 spin-offs. No dirty book's ever done that before or since. And I've done a number of other things like that. And suddenly, out comes John Carter of Mars, the movie. Well, no, it's not John Carter. John Carter, period. Why should we malign Mars? That was a pretty bad movie. But somebody came out with a collection, or not a collection, an anthology, John Joseph Adams, of Mars stories. I thought, wow, time to do an anthology. So I contact ERB Inc. I say, you guys mind? Can I have permission? They said, yeah, you can have permission. So I sold and I got a co-editor, Bob Garcia, and we sold the anthology to Bain Books. And then I am told by Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, you can do Tarzan, and you can do Venus, and you can do Pellucidar, and the Moon Maid, and Pelota. You can't do Mars. Disney owns Mars. I hadn't realized that. And finally we made a deal with them. Everything else in the book is new, but they gave me permission to reprint The Forgotten Sea of Mars. So after hiding from it for 48 years or so, it's going to be available again. At least you don't have to pay $300 to be disappointed. Now you can be disappointed for, I don't know, $8, $10, $12, whatever the paperback is. And some of the authors we've already got stories in from are Dick Lupoff, who certainly knows his Burroughs, and F. Paul Wilson, Joe Lansdale. We have stories assigned to Kevin Anderson, Christine Catherine Rush, Mercedes Lackey. It's going to be a nice book. Really. And, what else can I tell you about ERB? Almost nothing. I can tell you something. Hulbert Burroughs, Edgar Rice Burroughs' son, was running the corporation about the time I started getting involved in fandom and all. And we had a big fight because I was being a redeeming social value for all these men's magazines I was editing. Now, I would write science fiction stories and articles about the pulps and all, just to separate all the photos of buxom naked ladies. The Supreme Court insisted. These days, I don't think they care. But I did a long biography of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I got permission from Reed Crandall to use that wonderful frontispiece from Dick Lupoff's Master of Adventure book. And I told that to Hulbert, And Hulbert said, "No, you can't do that. That's a men's magazine." And Edgar, my father, was a Victorian. And I said, "Okay, this is what they're paying me, Hulbert. If you'll find somebody who'll pay me more, I'll pull them this." Well, that was the end of that, but Hulbert never spoke to me again. Speaking of Reed Crandall, the most interesting collector's item I ever saw, and possibly the most valuable by today, was an Edgar Rice Burroughs item. It was at the 1967 Worldcon in New York, which was one of the few times that all the artists, the major artists, came, because back then they all lived there. We didn't have computers and faxes and what have you. And Paul Allen, who had been publishing the Barsoomian, a Burroughs fanzine, came there with Dick Lupoff's book. And Reed Crandall was there, and he asked Crandall for an autograph. And Crandall instead drew a pen and ink sketch on one of the end papers. Then Paul sought out Frank Frazetta for an autograph. And Frazetta took a look at this and said, "Well, I could do better than that." And he did 2 pages of those. Then he drove out to Roy Krenkel's house. Krenkel was too sick to come. And Krenkel gave him a couple of pages. Then Al Williamson showed up. By the end of the weekend, he had 10 or 12 major artists doing Burroughs pen and inks in this book. And this is 1967, when the average guy made, $8,000? He'd already turned down $5,000 for the book. I never saw a ready-made collector's item like that in my life. It was really interesting. I should ask if there are any questions about anything so far. Oh, don't all ask at once. Yeah, we got some here.
Burroughs had a bad reputation, as I understand it, with the other.
Could you make that a little louder, please?
Burroughs had a bad reputation. He put him down, a lot of the science fiction writers. Has that changed? Are people appreciating him in the business?
Well, I think part of the reason he's put down is because he outsells everybody else. I don't think he's the most graceful writer around, but in 1912 he didn't have to be the most graceful. He was damn near the first. He was certainly writing fantastic adventure well before anyone else was. And even in the 1940s, he was selling to Ray Palmer and Amazing. Mark Twain tried to self-publish, and he went broke. Sinclair Lewis tried to self-publish, and he went broke. Burroughs self-published, and he made another few million. The guy was, he was a failed businessman up to the day he invented Mars and Tarzan, but thereafter, just about everything he touched turned to gold. Anyway, critics can find fault with him, but what critics tend to forget is that a lot of the stuff they're criticizing was written between 90 and 100 years ago. It was written for a different audience, in a different milieu, things that were considered, even in, quote, literary books back then, that were considered high style. Today look a little antiquated and a little silly. One of the interesting things is that I think Burroughs was really remarkable at creating languages. He had no skills at it, but what would you call an ape king that half grunted and half barked except Kriga? What would you call a snake except hista? I mean, throughout this thing, I don't know what his methodology was, but his words seemed to work. Not only his ape, the English language, but some of his Barsoomian terms, some of his Venusian terms. I don't think he would have written the same stories had he been writing today. He might have written it in the very same way, but, now that everybody knows Percival Lowell was wrong and there are no Cornells on Mars, he wouldn't have drawn that kind of a Mars. I think it would have been a pity, because that kind of a Mars is a very romantic thing. Speaking of that kind of Mars, maybe some of you haven't heard of it, but Gardner Dozois and George R.R. Martin are doing an anthology, original anthology, for Random House called Old Mars. And I'm in it. I channeled Lee Brackett this time instead of Burroughs. And what it is these are stories that could have been sold. I mean, this is the way they defined it. Stories that could have been sold about Mars prior to 1950. They don't want anything with computers. They don't want anybody saying, no, there's no atmosphere on Mars. They want stories such as Burroughs and Brackett and C.L. Moore would have written. And at the other extreme, Ray Bradbury, who most of his Martian Chronicles were before 1950. Next year, and I haven't been invited, each of us is only in one, they're doing Old Venus. So as hard as we try to escape from our pulp beginnings, they keep following us and we keep falling in love with them all over again. And anyway, I think that's an interesting book. Let me tell you about another one that has nothing to do with this, but that Gardner Dozois is also editing that I'm in that is going to be a hoot. It's coming out from audible.com as an audiobook, but there will also be a print version. And its title is Rip Off. And the conceit is that each of us was told that the opening sentence has to be the opening sentence of a book that's in public domain, of a classic. And then we write a science fiction story with that as the opening sentence. I wrote one of my Harry the Book, Damon Runyon-esque fantasies using the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice. Jim Kelly, James Patrick Kelly, just told me he's using the opening sentence of the Constitution of the United States because it saves him writing 300 words. And somebody, of course, did Call Me Ishmael. Somebody did in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. It should be a real interesting book when it comes out. There will be more and more Burroughs books, I think, or Burroughs-type books. My own feeling is that the best writer ever to come out of the pulps was probably Raymond Chandler, but in our field, the best writer would either be Ray Bradbury or the woman I love, C.L. Moore. I just wrote the introduction to Thunder in the Void by Henry Kuttner for Hefner Books, and I finally, in the introduction, forgave her at age 70 for marrying Kuttner 2 years before I was born and not waiting for me. Because I think she was wonderful. Anytime my sense of wonder needs a shot of adrenaline, I pick up a Northwest Smith story and I'm fine 20 minutes later. I think she was just remarkable. Brackett is, in the opinion of a lot of people, kind of a more sophisticated Burroughs. And I think that may very well be true. Her characters have an extra dimension compared to his. And her Mars is perhaps a little more fully fleshed, given that she wrote less stories on it. They're both fine entertainment. Other pulps, well, it was a lot of fun when I was a kid to read The Spider. I mean, if you were around today, the first thing you do is cuff them and lock them up. I mean, this was a guy who shot people for thinking of crimes or for looking like they were thinking of crimes. The Shadow was a lot of fun. It turns out that no, he wasn't Lamont Cranston, he was Kent Allard, and who the hell knows who he really was. There was one I especially liked. There were only 4 issues of it. It was called The Secret Six. And nobody had names. There was the Key and the this and the that. And as I remember, and it's been years since I read it, they were 6 former criminals or escaped criminals who banded together to fight worse criminals, which is always a lot of fun. Doc Savage, of course, is in a class by himself. If I have a guilty secret, it's that I still love watching that Doc Savage movie with Ron Ely. I don't know why the hell they didn't make sequels. I know that George Pal had bought the whole damn series. And speaking of Philip Jose Farmer, as everybody was in the last hour, I have a copy of the script he wrote for the sequel to Doc Savage. And I don't know why it wasn't made. It's every bit as much fun as the first one. Any other questions at all, or shall I just ramble on? Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Tarzan novel or favorite Burroughs novel?
Favorite Tarzan? It's very hard to beat the first one, Tarzan of the Apes. I very, very much like the short story one, Jungle Tales of Tarzan. Probably because there aren't any human beings in it except Tarzan, or I shouldn't say any human beings, any white men and any explorers, hunters, what have you.
You still go back and read it?
Can't hear you?
You still go back and read it?
Oh, I have to say it's probably been about 20 years since I've read any Burroughs. Since I started writing science fiction, I have written 71 novels, about 280 stories. I've edited 40 anthologies, and I've done 3 screenplays. I mean, I just don't have time to reread anymore. Also, about 5 years ago, I went blind in this eye, and for about a year, I was reading like a book every month with a great big magnifying glass. Finally, they invented the Nook so I could read again, but I just haven't got time to reread. One exception, once in a while I have to reread Me because I'm doing series, and I can't remember what one before, if it's like 2 years later, so I have to, just for verisimilitude, I have to do that. As Mars books go, well, if you could take the first 3 as one long book, that would be it. If I had to divide them out, probably The Gods of Mars. The first one, I did look at again after I saw the movie, because I kept thinking, he didn't do that bad a job. Why did the movie? And then I was looking, and I could see what the problem was, which is, Burroughs was learning how to write that. He was teaching himself. It takes him like 6 chapters to get to Mars. You can't do that in a movie. I mean, they had all this beginning, but nobody cared about that. They all wanted to see Mars. It takes him something like 1 chapter to decide he's going to risk his life to save the atmosphere plant. Most people in 1 chapter have barely met the guy sitting next to him on the train. So, I mean, there are just a lot of things that, because it was written in that era and adapted by a guy who had never done a live-action film before, he just had a lot of problems. And I know that they called in Michael Chabon, who's a Pulitzer winner, and more to the point, a Hugo winner, to doctor the script. And he pretty much gave up because he said, every time he wanted to make a change, the director who had done the script, I can't remember his name, said no. And in Hollywood, the director is God. Would you like to hear some funny Hollywood stories? Okay. One of the problems I have in Hollywood is dealing with these people, because while they are sharks compared to the publishers, the book publishers, who are minnows, they are sharks at making deals, but they don't understand anything about art or structure or anything else. And you'll sit at the conference table, and sooner or later, one of these hotshots is going to say the equivalent of, well, why can't one of the twins be black? Or, yeah, we could do the Katharine Hepburn story, but let's get a Katharine with Hooters. And, I mean, it drives you crazy. I did this novel, Santiago, and I sold it to a company called Capella, and they hired me to write the screenplay. In it, you have to take my word that it's effective. There is a cyborg spaceship. He doesn't want to be a cyborg. He crashed on a planet, never saw a man before. This was the way they put him back together. And they gave him a directive that he can't kill himself. And all he wants to do is die and end this hideous existence. So he makes a deal with the protagonist. I will take you where you want to go, do you this service, order me to fly into a star so I don't have to put up with his existence anymore. And it happens. And it was a sad scene of the book. And I write it in the movie. And it was a beautiful scene, if I say so myself. And I'm sitting around the table with the producer, the director, 7 or 8 executives, I, the screenwriter, and the only person who doesn't have script approval. And they start talking, and the producer says, there won't be a dry eye in the house. The director says, this will be the most memorable scene in the film. Special effects guy says, I can do it in an afternoon. Around it goes. Everybody loves it. We get to the last guy in line. He's the marketing director. He says, you can't do that. If you kill the ship, we can't sell 2 million toy ships in the stores. 11 guys go like this. We never thought of it. Kill the scene. That's one of the reasons I'm not really thrilled with Hollywood. I'll tell you another reason. I'll tell you a reason why I am thrilled with it. It's while I was writing Santiago for these guys, they would fly me out to story conferences every couple of months. They had hired a director and a cinematographer and a special effects guy, who were a team, actually. And this was going to be their second film. And their first film was going to be something they were doing for Miramax. And one day, Miramax asked them, what are you guys doing for Capella? So they showed them my script. And Miramax said, we love it. We got to talk to this guy. Now, if you wanted to talk to me, he'd call me on the phone. But this is Hollywood. They can't do that. And they can't fly to Cincinnati because you can't do movie business in Cincinnati. And they wouldn't fly me to New York, their headquarters, because you don't do movies in New York. So they waited till the next time I was out in California for a story conference, and they flew 2 vice presidents out to have breakfast with me. And they were back in New York in the late afternoon. But anyway, we have breakfast, and they say, we love your stuff, and we want to buy a book from you, and we want you to do the screenplay, which is always a nice way to have breakfast. And I said, sure, I'll go home, I'll find stuff that's not under option, and I'll send you a few. So I go home, I send them, I think, 12, 13 books that weren't under option, and they write back and they say, we're terribly sorry, but we don't want to make any of these. I figure, well, at least they bought me breakfast. And the next day, or the next week, a new book of mine comes out. It was called The Widowmaker, first of a series. And Bantam was publishing it, and they took out a full-page ad in Locus. And the top 3/4 of the page was for my book, which was one of their monthly leaders. Bottom quarter of the page was for a science fiction book by Chris Claremont, based on a 2-page outline by George Lucas. But because it's George Lucas, they listed him as the co-author. So I figured, what the hell? Just as a joke, I Xeroxed the ad, and I sent it to Miramax to say, see, maybe you don't like me, but in my field, I'm 3 times more important than George Lucas. And I got a phone call from them 2 days later, the day they got my letter. They said, we want to buy The Widowmaker, we want you to script it. I said, it's not even out yet. Don't you want to read it? They said, we don't have to read it. You're 3 times as important as George Lucas. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. So, they have to wait till the next time I'm in California. Of course, they can't talk to me before then. And I'm in California for another story conference, and they say, we want to have dinner with you. So, where? We're going to have dinner in the Four Seasons. I mean, if there's a more expensive restaurant, I don't know where it is. And we've already hired Peter Hyams, who's just done End of Days, and he had done 2010, A Space Odyssey or sequel, whatever it was. And he's going to be your director, and we'll meet you guys at the restaurant. We'll fly 6 of us out. They flew 6 guys out from New York in the afternoon to eat with us. And we get there, my wife and I. I'm wearing a 3-piece suit because this is big money. And she's wearing, dress and hose and all. And we see a guy hanging around. He's got a hole in his blue jeans in his knee, and a T-shirt and gold chains. And everybody's obsequious to the max and seat him at a table. And we said to ourselves, it's got to be our director. And sure enough, the way you show that you have clout in Hollywood is how badly can you dress and get served at a 5-star restaurant. So we go in, we meet him, and the 5 guys from Miramax come in from the airport, and we're sitting around. It turns out nobody has read the book. And I say to Peter, who tells me what he thinks the story should be about, that, actually, this is part of a trilogy, and the guy you think is the villain is the hero. And Peter says, this is the story I want to make. And the director's God, you make his story. Somebody, writers are interchangeable. So he said, sure, I'll write it the way you want. I go home and I write a treatment, which is like an outline, 8-9 pages. I send it off to all the executives in New York and Peter out west. And he calls back and says, 3 changes I want to make, this, and this. And we say, well, I said, 2 of them are okay, one's kind of dumb. And he didn't fire me, so I knew we had a good relationship. And I made the 2 changes. Now I should tell you, when I sent the treatment off the first time, they sent me a check for $10,000 for an 8-page treatment. I said, how long has this been going on? And I make the changes, send me another check, same thing. They play with monopoly money out there. And the best example of it is, after I give him the treatment he wants, I don't hear from anybody for 4 or 5 months. And finally I say, I call Peter and I say, Peter, you guys said you wanted to start shooting in August. It's already April, doesn't anybody want a screenplay? And he says, kid, I'm 10 years older than him, but he's been in Hollywood longer. Kid, you don't do anything till the Weinstein brothers, who own Miramax, pass on it. Sure enough, I get a call from one of my vice presidents who keeps flying out to have lunch with me in California. And he says, we're really, really sorry, but we're not going to make the movie because our first film, which was a sequel to The Crow, I can't remember what it was called, our first science fiction film came out and it bombed. And Bob Weinstein doesn't understand science fiction. Anyhow, he just doesn't want to do it. I said, well, okay, you guys overpaid me for 2 treatments. You gave me a brunch. Great. And about 8 weeks later, I get a call from my attorney. And it's a Hollywood attorney. You can get by without a Hollywood agent, but you got to have a Hollywood attorney to go over those contracts. Typical book contracts, about 6 pages, 5 pages. Small Hollywood contracts, about 85 pages. Anyway, she calls and says, well, it's time to go in for the screenplay. I said, didn't I tell you the project's canceled? And she says, yeah. I said, I didn't tell you that I didn't write the screenplay. And she said, yeah. And I said, what part of I didn't write the screenplay don't you understand? And she said, why don't you look at your contract that you paid me all this money to negotiate? They bought your exclusive time for 8 weeks, and if they chose not to use it, tough shit. We're billing him for the screenplay. And I said, yeah, I'm a Midwesterner. I have this work ethic. I can't do that. I don't want to work in this town again. And she said, no, it happens all the time. Trust me. I said, okay, you can bill him, but you can't say I gave you permission. 2 days later, I got what remains to this day the biggest check I've ever gotten as a writer for not writing that screenplay. Ready for the sequel? 6 weeks later, she calls again, says, time to bill him for revisions. This time I said, sure. And I got another check the same size. And I thought that was going to be my convention speech for the rest of my life. I made a 1-hour speech out of it. I gave it in conjunction and at RiverCon and 2-3 other places. And then I get a call from my vice president saying, Bob Weinstein wants the script. I said, you guys changed your mind. You're going to make the movie, right? He says, no, he just hears you're making an ass of him and he wants the script. And I said, well, I'll give you the best script you ever saw. He said, it doesn't matter. You can give us blank pages. He's going to cancel the contract. He just wants the script. So I took a month. I sent him the script. According to Federal Express, he got it at 10:37 on a Tuesday morning, and before noon, the project was canceled. That's what Hollywood's like. Anyway, you haven't noticed either of those in the theaters, have you? However, if you're coming to WorldCon in 2 or 3 weeks, where I'm the guest of honor, I will be taking 3 hours to show you 5 short films based on short stories of mine. What happens, I suppose happens to most writers, is sooner or later you start getting some phone calls from film school students who want to make a movie, 20, 30 minutes, whatever, out of your story. And basically it's their master's thesis. So I've always agreed, provided we sign a contract, that it's amateur, they can't make money on it, so that I'm still free to sell those rights elsewhere. And they send me a copy, and I've gotten their permission from 5 of them to show them at the WorldCon. And these are films that will never be seen again. They've only been seen by their professors. So that's the best I can do. I wish I could do you the Miramax film, but I've been well paid for it. Okay, anyway, thank you for your attention spans and to your scattered parties.